Today, I'm going to answer a question that I've asked on a very regular basis from small stakes players. And that is, how should I play in situations where lots and lots of people limp and then it is on me in the blinds? First things first, what are the limpers' strategies? This is very, very important. Are they straightforward limpers who limp with mostly kind of junky hands that they don't think are good enough to raise? Or are they tricky limpers who will limp with pocket aces and pocket kings, hoping somebody will raise? That's a really, really important question, because if they're limping with all sorts of junk, well, then this is a spot where you want to be pretty aggressive. But if they're limping with aces and kings, then, some marginal hands, that's a spot where you want to be incredibly passive, right? Because you have to realize that you're going to be out of position against these limpers, which means that either you want them to do a whole lot of folding, or you just want to keep the pot small and you want to see if you flop something. Next, are your opponent's calling stations? As they're going to limp with more marginal stuff, but then call every single time with it, that should result in you raising with a very strong linear range. Like if they're going to limp and call a raise with king 9 offsuit, raising stuff like king jack suited is probably pretty good, right? But if they're going to be limping and then folding the king 9 offsuit, that's fine, but assuming they're not limping and folding a whole lot of marginal stuff and they're going to call you with all the logical hands, well, then maybe you should not necessarily even raise in that scenario with something like king jack suited. Also, understand that the first limper is your main concern, because the first limper is the limper that's most likely to be trapping, right? Because usually if one player limps, the limpers after the first limper usually do not limp behind with hands like aces and kings, because they really, really, really don't want to have a bunch of other people limp and then see a 7-way flop with 7 big blinds in it with pocket aces. It's not the worst spot in the world, but it's also not good. And they know that if the initial limper is limping something reasonable, they're going to call a raise. So they get to play a pot in position with pocket aces, right? So you're going to find that the first limper is the one you need to be most concerned about being tricky. And because of that, the subsequent limpers will usually have okay hands, but generally a weak range, because if their hands were good, they would have raised, right? Also, in your particular games, you are definitely going to want to experience raising to various raise sizes. Now, let's say 4 people limp and it's on you in the big blind. In that scenario, if you're going to raise, you usually want to make it something like a pot size bet or even bigger. A pot size bet is 3 times the last bet plus any additional money in the pot. So let's say there are 3 limpers. The last bet was the last limper. So 3 times the last limper is 1 big blind. So we're going to make it 3 plus 1 big blind more for this first limper. This first limper. 1 big blind for the initial raiser. So that's 3, 4, 5 plus any additional money in the pot. Your big blind and the small blind. So we're looking at something like 5.5 big blinds. Because we're out of position, we usually want to make it even a little bit more. So like 6.5 or 7 big blinds. That's about as small as I would ever go in this scenario. What a lot of people do very wrong in this spot is 3 people limp and they'll raise to 3 or 4 big blinds from the big blind. Well, in that scenario, your opponents are going to call every time because they're getting amazing pot odds in position. If you give people amazing pot odds in position, they're going to call every time. So usually you're going to want to raise to something like 7 big blinds or more in that scenario, because then they actually will start to fold. Imagine somebody limps with the 10-8 suited and you make it 8 big blinds. You really want to put in 7 big blinds more with the 10-8 suited? Not really, right? And that's the way to get a hand that has pretty good equity in position against you to fold. If your opponents are going to limp with all very marginal ranges, like let's say junky suited connectors, junky offsuit hands, ace-x, etc., maybe you want to make it something like 15 big blinds. That may sound crazy. Imagine 3 people limp, you make it 15 big blinds. If they are going to fold literally their entire range because they are not tricky, because you already know from playing with them a ton, they raise all their best hands, they limp all their marginal stuff, the pot is literally free for you. It's pretty nice to get a free 4.5 or 5 or 6 or whatever it is big blinds, because your opponent's ranges are very unprotected and they are literally never going to call a 15 big blind raise with the ace-3 offsuit or the 10-8 suited or the jack-8 offsuit. They're just not going to do it, right? So you definitely want to experiment with these raise sizes against players' ranges who you think are going to be very, very weak. So let's first discuss specific scenarios from when you are in the small blind. Understand that when it goes limp, 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 your pot odds increase as more and more players have limped, right? And usually you're putting in half a big blind to try to win 4, 5, 6, 7 big blinds, right? So you really need to realize like almost no equity in these scenarios. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to call with a pretty wide range of hands that can reasonably flop effective nut hands. So that's going to be pairs, suited connectors, really a lot of suited hands. Then connected hands like 7-6 offsuit, maybe 6-4 offsuit. 6-3 offsuit's probably pretty rough. 9-5 offsuit's probably pretty rough, but if these hands are suited, you can play them. You should, however, fold hands that have huge reverse implied odds that can't reasonably make straights or flushes. This is going to be hands like King 5 offsuit, Queen 7 offsuit, 9-2 offsuit, etc. Yeah, you can make 3 of a kind with these hands. You can make top pair, but you have to realize you don't really want to make top pair with a hand like King 5 because if any amount of money goes into this pot, you're probably actually in not that great a shape because they're going to have better than top pair. And realize that even though you are getting very good pot odds, you're going to have a very tough time actually realizing that equity, and you're out of position, which means that usually with a hand like King 5 offsuit, you're either going to win a small pot or lose a big one. And that's really where you do not want to be. So you should fold out the junky offsuit hands. A lot of people make the blunder of calling with any 2 cards in the small blind whenever it goes limp, limp, limp in front of them because they think, all right, I'm getting 7-1 odds, so I'm always going to realize whatever it is. Like, I mean, let's say there's 7 limpers and you have to put in half a big blind. So you need to win 1/14 of the pot. It's not that hard, right? The problem, though, is that you actually may win less than that with a hand like 9-2 offsuit. So forgive me for my rough math, by the way. If you appreciate my rough math, I'm doing my best to record this in one take. Do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button below. Show me some love. I feel insecure when I cannot do simple division for all of you. I feel the shame. Okay. You want to raise with your best hands, straight up for value, and then perhaps some hands that cannot call as a bluff. We're raising really polarized here, which I realize is not necessarily the GTO strategy in this spot. But remember, if your opponents are limping with stuff that's mostly going to fold if you raise, well, then you should start raising a lot. And some of the best hands to raise are hands that block your opponent's continuing range. So that's going to be stuff like Ace X, King X, and Queen X, the offsuit ones, because you'd rather just call with the suited ones that can flop well. And this is assuming they will fold, right? If your opponents are calling stations and they're going to call any raise no matter what, maybe you want to raise with a slightly wider linear range, including hands like Ace 10, King Jack suited, etc. But in general, in spots like this against limpers, you probably want to raise with something like pocket 9s and better, Ace Jack offsuit and better, Ace 10 suited and better, King Queen suited, King Queen offsuit maybe. Those are hands you want to raise in pretty much all scenarios, unless you think the initial limper is very tricky, in which case you should raise with a substantially stronger range, right? And then, assuming we do limp, assuming we do see the flop, you usually want to play pretty straightforwardly, because there's going to be 4, 5, 6 people in the pot, and someone's probably going to flop something. And if it's not you, well, it's probably someone else, right? Now, certainly you may find yourself in a spot where it like checks through on the flop, and then on the turn brings like a low blank card, and you think you're probably in pretty good shape to steal the pot. Maybe you want to throw out a bluff, especially if you have something reasonable, like some sort of draw. But for the most part, in multi-way pots, you just don't need to get all that out of line when you are first act. It's okay. Remember, you put in almost nothing. You don't flop anything. It is okay to get out of the way. Let's now discuss from the big blind. Well, now it is free to check and see the flops. You're going to see the flop with all your hands, but you do want to raise sometimes. And you want to raise with, again, your best hands that are in a good shape against a limp calling range, and perhaps some bluffs. Now, again, in this scenario, you're probably going to want to raise exploitatively with a pretty junky range of hands that are not good at all post-flop, but have blockers to your opponent's continuing ranges, which again will be hands like King X, Queen X, Jack X. And I want to make it clear, if your opponents are never going to fold, don't do this. I actually wrote a book a long time ago called Strategies for Beating Small Stakes Poker Tournaments, where I went and I played 1-2-no limit at Borgata for like, must have been 2 weeks. Anytime I had free time during a poker tournament, I'd go play 1-2-no limit. And I got a bunch of bluffs through with the Jack 4 offsuit, and the Jack 3 offsuit, and the Jack 5 offsuit. Those are my hands where I was experimenting. I'm going to try it every time with the Jack 4 offsuit when it goes limp, 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 and it's on me in the big blind. And I probably got through 3 for 3 in bluffs, where it went limp, limp, limp. I made it 15 big blinds, gigantic, and they go full, full, full. Easy game, right? Now, if that is how it's going to go, remember, I want to make this really clear. If it goes limp, 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 and you make it 15 big blinds and they fold every time, you should be doing this play quite aggressively until they start playing back. And if your opponents are anywhere near competent, they'll either stop limping or they'll start limping with more traps. And as they limp with more traps, you have to start being way more cautious with the total airball raise. So anyway, usually just want to raise with your best hands. If they're going to call with a lot of marginal stuff, you want to raise with a stronger linear range. And as they're going to either re-raise or fold, you want to be re-raising with a much more polarized, junky range with the various blocker cards like ace, king, queen, or jack. And then again, you're going to want to play somewhat straightforwardly post-flop in a 4 or 5-way limp pot because you're out of position and somebody probably has something. Let's now talk a little bit more about post-flop play. Typically, in a very multi-way pot, you're going to want to just check everything when there are lots of players yet to act. And that's because, again, you're out of position. You typically just don't want to be putting money into the pot from out of position. Next, if your opponents are especially passive, if you think you're in a game where when it goes a bunch of limps, you check the flop, they're all just going to check behind very frequently, that's not actually good for you, especially when you have your best made hands, strong draws, or junky draws. With all those hands, you don't really mind if either more money goes in the pot or your opponents fold. So essentially, you're betting with a good, strong, polarized range from out of position if you expect your opponents to check way too often. Because if you think about it, the hands you most likely want to be putting in a check raise with are going to be these type of hands. Your best made hands that are likely to be outdrawn, like bottom 2 pair, top kicker, over pairs, stuff like that. And then also, you want to be check raising with your best draws, your high equity straight flush draws, stuff like that. Then also some junky draws like gut shots. And by check raising with that range, it puts your opponents in a pretty nasty spot because their marginal made hands like top pair no kicker lose to your value hands. They're not in great shape against your premium draws and they're crushing your junky draws. So they're kind of lost, right? But if they're not going to be betting all that often when you check to them, you'd rather just lead these hands yourself. Also, a very, very important point. I cannot make this any more clear. When it goes bet call or bet raise, you want to be very, very cautious. So many players, when it goes bet and call, they're sitting there with middle pair, no kicker, think, all right, well, I have 5 outs. I guess I should call and try to get there. The problem is that when you do get there, there's no guarantee you're going to get paid off by top pair bad kicker or whatever. Also, sometimes when you get there, you're still beat, right? So you're drawing to, let's say, 5 outs to either make trips or to pair your kicker. And when you do get there, sometimes you still lose a huge pot. That is not where you want to be. Typically, when you're drawing, getting okay odds from out of position, you want to be drawing to a hand that's pretty much always the nuts, or at least close enough to the nuts. So facing a bet and a call, you need to be very cautious. Usually stuff like middle pair is no good. But in small stakes games, I see players call with these hands every single time because they think, oh, it's probably good, or it may be good. And to be fair, it may be good. And sometimes it's going to check down on the turn and the river and you would have won. But usually not, because usually people bet the flop, they have some equity. And if somebody calls, they have some equity. So you're really just not winning these pots all that often at all. And if it does go bet and raise before it gets to you, now you need a really, really strong hand unless your opponents are particularly loose and aggressive and maniacal. Okay? So again, facing limpers, assess the initial limper strategy. As they are limping with more premium hands, you should take basically every bluff out of your range and also don't raise for thin value. You only want to be raising with the best hands. But as the limpers limp with wider junky ranges, or just junky ranges in general that will fold very frequently to a raise, and as they are not especially calling stations, which pretty much no one's a calling station for a 15 big blind raise, that's when you can really start mixing in some very aggressive bluffs, and you'll just steal the pot a large portion of the time. Now, if you want to take this to maximum exploitative territory, maybe you raise it to 7 big blinds with all of your nuts that you want action with, and you make it 15 with all your bluffs. Obviously, that's incredibly face-up, and your opponents will figure that out very quickly. So you either need to raise everything to 7 or everything to 15, or maybe still just mix it up, but realize that you can't just have a strategy that never changes when you are making very exploitative plays against players, because they're very quickly going to realize, all right, I limp and this player makes it 15 big blinds. I better only limp with good hands, right? So realize that there's not just one default strategy you should use in all scenarios in these spots, because players' limping ranges are all over the place. They're not playing some sort of GTO strategy, so there's not really a clearly defined GTO counter strategy, right? They're making some sort of mistakes, and it's up to you to figure out what mistakes they're making at this point in time. Because to be fair, if they're limping aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace king, because they think someone's going to raise a lot, but then you never raise, well, you just took away a ton of equity from them, right? So if you can figure out roughly what their strategy is in these scenarios, you can massively exploit them and win a ton of money from these limpers, either by being overly aggressive or overly passive. So that's going to be it for today. If you enjoyed this video, click the like and subscribe buttons below. If you have anyone who you know who has trouble playing against limpers, send them this video. I would appreciate it, and they will appreciate it too. Good luck, have fun, and I hope you win all the money from the limpers.